Let's talk about the U.S. Constitution. It's a document that's all about liberty, right? But it has this deep, troubling contradiction baked right into it. So the question is, how on earth did a charter for freedom end up protecting the institution of slavery?
Well, the answer is right there in the text, in 3 really specific clauses that were bargained into the final document. First up, you've got the Slave Trade Clause, which basically told Congress it couldn't touch the international slave trade until 1808. Then there's the infamous 3/5 Clause, which gave slave states a ton more political power by counting a fraction of their enslaved population. And finally, the Fugitive Slave Clause, which forced even free states to send escaped slaves back to their enslavers. You put them all together, and bam, slavery is cemented into the law of the land.
So how did this happen? Well, these compromises didn't just pop up out of nowhere. No, they were fought for, tooth and nail. And a lot of that fight was led by one man, a figure who's often overlooked but was, you could say, the main architect of these pro-slavery protections. He showed up in Philadelphia with one single-minded mission.
And who was this guy? Charles Pinckney. At just 29 years old, he was one of the youngest delegates there, but he was no lightweight. He was a rich lawyer and a powerful planter from South Carolina, and his entire fortune, we're talking his plantation, Sneef Farm, and the people he enslaved there, was completely dependent on the very institution he came to Philadelphia to defend.
And Pinckney, he did not beat around the bush. When the debate about the slave trade really heated up, he basically dropped this bombshell on the convention. It wasn't some high-minded philosophical point. It was a straight-up ultimatum. He was making it absolutely crystal clear. For South Carolina to join this new nation, protecting slavery was non-negotiable. Period.
You can just imagine how that went over. Pinckney's threat landed in a room that was already basically a tinderbox. This wasn't some minor disagreement. It was a deep, fundamental conflict that was threatening to blow the whole constitutional project sky high. Seriously, the whole thing was right on the edge of falling apart.
And this right here, this just lays out how deep that divide was. On one side, you have guys like George Mason of Virginia. And get this, he was a slaveholder himself, calling slavery an infernal traffic. But on the other side, you've got Charles Pinckney just coolly arguing, hey, if slavery is wrong, then the whole world is wrong. These weren't just different points of view. They were 2 completely separate realities crashing into each other.
And it wasn't just a two-man show. You had all these different voices chiming in. You had your pragmatists like Oliver Ellsworth from Connecticut, basically saying, look, what's good for one part is good for the whole, so let's just make a deal. Then you had the hardliners like John Rutledge saying it's all about self-interest, folks. And pushing back against all of that were people like Luther Martin, who saw the whole thing as a flat-out betrayal of the American Revolution. The room was a powder keg of competing interests, money, morality, and the very soul of the new nation were all on the line.
So what happens when you've got a total deadlock and the whole country is hanging by a thread? A deal gets made. But this wasn't some triumphant moral victory. Nope. It was a cold, hard political bargain. And this was the moment it all went down.
Gouverneur Morris, a delegate from Pennsylvania, he really saw what was happening. He understood that with everyone stuck in their moral corners, the only path forward was a transaction, a straight-up deal between the North and the South.
So, what was this grand bargain? Well, it was a classic quid pro quo, a real you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. The South got what it wanted most, 20 more years of the slave trade guaranteed. And what did the North get in return? One of their biggest priorities, giving the new federal government the power to regulate commerce with a simple majority vote. Each side walked away with something they felt they absolutely had to have.
And this was the magic number, 1808. You know, after some serious back and forth, the Southern delegates, with the Pinckneys leading the charge, managed to push the date from an initial proposal of 1800 all the way to 1808. That's a 20-year guarantee that the federal government couldn't lay a finger on the international slave trade.
But for Charles Pinckney, that big bargain was just the warm-up act. He played a key role in locking down 2 other huge victories for the South, and these went way beyond just the slave trade. They fundamentally shifted the balance of power in the new nation for decades to come.
Okay, so first up, he and another South Carolinian, Pierce Butler, introduced what would become the Fugitive Slave Clause. This was massive. It essentially made the capture of escaped slaves a federal issue, meaning even if an enslaved person made it to a free state, they were never truly safe.
Then, second, Pinckney was a major force behind the 3/5 clause, seconding the motion that would count 3/5 of the enslaved population when divvying up seats in Congress.
Just think about that. 3/5. That one little fraction had gigantic consequences. It completely pumped up the South's political power both in Congress and in presidential elections for the next 70 years. And all that power was built on counting a population of people who had zero rights, couldn't vote, and were literally considered property.
And if you want to know how the South felt about this, just listen to this quote from Charles Pinckney's own cousin. He was basically bragging to the South Carolina legislature about the Fugitive Slave Clause. For them, this wasn't some compromise they begrudgingly accepted. No way. This was a win, a clear victory. They had managed to write their right to own people into the national playbook, giving them a power they had never had before.
So, in the end, the Constitution gets ratified, and the Union is saved. But wow, at what a cost. These deals, the ones pushed through by guys like Charles Pinckney, they didn't solve the problem of slavery. Not at all. They just kicked the can down the road, leaving behind a really complicated and frankly tragic legacy.
And you can see that legacy play out right here on this timeline. There's a direct line from those compromises in 1787 to a national disaster. The clauses they baked into the Constitution just set the stage for decades of conflict that kept getting worse. The Fugitive Slave Clause gets beefed up in 1850, which just poured gasoline on the fire. And ultimately, that failure to deal with slavery at the very beginning led straight to the Civil War in 1861.
But here's where the story gets even more twisted. The very same man, Charles Pinckney, who worked so hard to protect slavery, also fought for some key civil liberties. He's the reason there's a no religious test clause for holding public office. He also helped ensure we have the writ of habeas corpus, that fundamental protection against being locked up unlawfully. He is the walking, talking embodiment of the contradictions of that whole era.
Which brings us all the way back to this really tough question. The compromises made in 1787 absolutely held the Union together. But they did it by protecting an institution that flew in the face of the nation's own ideals, and it led to unimaginable suffering and a brutal war. So it really makes you wonder, when you're trying to build a nation, is any compromise, no matter how necessary it seems in the moment, really worth the price?